when I was doing that part. I was in the street, but I look like me, right? I don't have black hair and white hair, and so.
Glenn Close has always been a towering presence on screen, icy, fierce, and unforgettable. With her piercing eyes and surgical precision, she brought to life some of the most iconic, complex women in cinematic history. She terrified audiences in Fatal Attraction, shattered hearts in The Wife, and commanded respect in Dangerous Liaisons. And yet, for all the accolades, all the standing ovations, all the red carpets and nominations, there has always been a haunting stillness behind her smile. Because behind the facade of control and brilliance, Glenn Close has lived a life filled with profound emotional pain, personal struggle, and an almost unbearable sense of being invisible in the moments that mattered most. At 78, she is finally speaking openly, not just about the roles she played, but about the roles she never got to live in real life. The daughter of a man who disappeared into a cult, the mother who lost connection with her daughter during her rise to fame, the artist who, despite being nominated for an Oscar 8 times, never once took the trophy home. It's not just unfair, it's tragic. And now, in her own words and in the whispers of those who know her best, the heartbreaking truth of Glenn Close's life is finally being told. Because sometimes the strongest women on screen are carrying the deepest wounds off it. Before Glenn Close ever stepped onto a stage or faced a camera, she was already living a performance she never asked for. One shaped not by scripts or spotlights, but by silence, obedience, and confusion. Born in 1947 into a privileged but emotionally fractured New England family, Glenn was the daughter of a respected doctor, William Close, who served as a private physician to the notorious dictator Mobutu Sese Seko in Zaire. But behind the prestige and global travel was something far more disturbing. At just 7 years old, Glenn was thrust into the grip of a radical religious cult known as Moral Rearmament, or MRA, a secretive movement that cloaked spiritual manipulation beneath a sheen of moral discipline. Her parents, deeply drawn into the group's ideology, uprooted their children's lives and subjected them to an environment where individuality was crushed, emotion was mistrusted, and unquestioning loyalty was the rule. Glenn later described the experience not as religious devotion, but as emotional servitude. "You weren't allowed to do anything for yourself," she revealed. Everything was about being of service, to something that never gave back. For years, she lived in communal housing, surrounded by adults who preached control and purity while extinguishing any spark of personal expression. She wasn't allowed to question, she wasn't allowed to feel, and perhaps most devastatingly, she wasn't allowed to speak out. Even now, Glenn admits she still carries the residue of that silence in her body, an ingrained fear of rocking the boat, of being too much. It wasn't until she was well into her 20s that she finally broke free of the MRA. But by then, the emotional blueprint had been set. She had learned to mask pain with composure, to suppress vulnerability with discipline. Acting ironically became her salvation. It was the first space where she was not only allowed, but required to feel deeply. And in a cruel twist of fate, the world would come to applaud her ability to portray emotional extremes, even as she struggled privately to name her own. But perhaps most haunting of all was the role her father played in it all. William Close wasn't just complicit. He was devoted to the MRA, leading his family into a system that eventually took more than it ever gave back. Glenn adored him, and that's what made the betrayal so profound. "He gave his life to something that didn't love us," she once said, her voice shaking. And yet, she never confronted him directly. The hurt remained buried, only surfacing in subtle ways. Through the characters she chose, the emotional restraint she carried into every role, the invisible weight behind her eyes. Even as she rose to fame in the 1980s and 90s, earning acclaim for her fierce intelligence and commanding presence, she remained haunted by the feeling that she didn't really belong to herself. Hollywood embraced her as the woman who could do anything: villain, mother, aristocrat, survivor. But few realized that behind each powerhouse performance was a little girl still waiting to be seen without conditions. Still longing for a father who chose faith over family, Glenn Close never asked for sympathy. She rarely spoke of her childhood in detail. But those who knew her best, friends, colleagues, former partners, have all echoed the same sentiment. She has spent her entire life trying to reclaim something that was taken too early. A voice. A sense of safety, a self. And though she would go on to conquer stages and screens around the world, earning accolades few could dream of, the question remained, at what cost? Because while the world watched Glenn Close become a legend, it never quite saw the little girl who disappeared before the story ever began. By the time Glenn Close became a household name, the world assumed she had finally arrived at peace. The awards piled up. The interviews glowed. The roles kept coming, more complex, more iconic. And yet, behind every standing ovation was a woman quietly unraveling. Fame for Glenn was never a cure. It was a camouflage. With every brilliant performance, she was applauded for bearing her soul, yet off-camera, she felt more isolated than ever. The same world that adored her on screen seemed unable or unwilling to connect with the woman behind the characters. Relationships, too, became difficult terrain. Glenn married and divorced young, a union that lasted only a few years, and every romantic connection that followed came with its own form of fracture. She once admitted that while she could access every emotion on camera, in real life, she struggled to communicate even the simplest ones. "I didn't learn how to share myself," she confessed in a rare moment of raw honesty. "So I just gave everything to the work." But the work didn't hug her back. It didn't stay after the curtain call. It didn't ask how she was when the lights went out. Her romantic life became a series of near misses, almosts that never quite became forever. And perhaps the most painful part was how many people assumed she was fine. That she was strong, that she didn't need anyone. "I became the woman who didn't cry," she once said. "Because if I started, I didn't know if I'd stop." Even motherhood, one of the few constants in her life, came with sacrifice. Raising her daughter while navigating the demands of a brutal industry left her torn between being present and being excellent. Two roles no one had taught her how to balance. And all the while, the accolades kept coming. 8 Oscar nominations, 3 Emmys, 3 Tonys, but never the Oscar win. And over time, it became more than just a missing statue. It became a symbol of being almost enough, of always falling just short, of putting everything on the line and still hearing not quite. And yet, she never lashed out. She never begged for validation. She just kept working, quietly, fiercely, invisibly breaking. Colleagues say she'd show up to set knowing every word of the script, every nuance of her character, yet rarely spoke about herself. She knew everyone else's pain, one director recalled, but no one knew hers. And maybe that's why her performances were so haunting, because she was living the ache she portrayed. And if you're feeling the weight of this truth, if Glenn Close has ever moved you in a way you couldn't explain, now is the time to honor the woman behind the screen. Like this video, subscribe for more untold stories of Hollywood's most misunderstood legends. And share your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes silence hides the deepest sorrow, and speaking it aloud is the first act of healing. Glenn Close didn't just act, she endured. And while the world kept clapping, it never truly saw the quiet devastation behind her grace. It wasn't until much later in life, long after the applause had faded between roles and the headlines had moved on to younger stars, that Glenn Close finally allowed herself to fall apart, quietly, privately, and terrifyingly. For most of her adult life, she had carried the unbearable expectation to be invincible, to remain the composed, cerebral actress who never flinched, never cracked. But no one is built for that kind of silence, and eventually, even Glenn's armor began to splinter. In a rare interview that stunned even her most loyal fans, she admitted to struggling with deep, persistent depression, something she had carried since childhood but never named. "There were days I couldn't get out of bed," she confessed. "I felt like I was disappearing, like nothing I did mattered." It wasn't a dramatic breakdown. It was slow erosion, a daily loss of self, a kind of inner exhaustion that couldn't be fixed by applause or critical acclaim. And for someone so disciplined, so meticulous, that kind of emotional chaos felt like failure. Her life became smaller. Phone calls went unanswered, invitations ignored. Even her beloved daughter began to notice the shift, moments when Glenn would stare off into space, vacant and unreachable. But what made it all the more heartbreaking was that nobody around her expected her to be struggling. Glenn Close, to them, was too smart, too strong, too accomplished to fall apart. The irony was devastating. She was admired for the very traits that prevented anyone from checking if she was okay. And when she did finally speak up, when she admitted to years of untreated depression and generational trauma, it wasn't for sympathy. It was to stop the cycle. Glenn revealed that her own family had a long history of emotional suppression and mental illness, including a sibling who suffered in silence for years. "We come from a culture of denial," she said. "And I lived in that culture, performed in that culture, for too long." It was this realization that finally pushed her to start speaking publicly, not about her characters, but about herself. And what followed was perhaps her bravest act yet. She launched a foundation dedicated to mental health awareness, using her own story to advocate for those who had never had the courage, or the platform, to share theirs. It was a turning point, but it didn't fix everything. Fame, she learned, could amplify pain just as easily as it could distract from it. In Hollywood, vulnerability is often used as currency, but rarely treated as truth. And Glenn, now in her 70s, found herself caught in the middle, too legendary to fade away, too human to keep pretending. The offers slowed. The industry shifted, and for a while she considered stepping away altogether. Not in anger, but in quiet resignation. "I didn't know who I was without the work," she admitted, "and that scared me more than anything." She began to ask questions most stars don't allow themselves to ask. Had she wasted her life performing for a world that never really saw her? Had she sacrificed real connection for temporary reverence? And if she stopped acting tomorrow, would anyone still care about the woman behind the eyes? These weren't just the doubts of an aging star. They were the deep, existential aches of a woman confronting the emptiness fame had failed to fill. Glenn Close had built a career on becoming other people, but somewhere along the way, she had misplaced the thread of her own identity. And now, stripped of pretense, she was left with one terrifying, liberating truth. She didn't need the role anymore. She needed herself. Now, at 78, Glenn Close is no longer chasing the roles, the awards, or the applause. The woman who once captivated the world by becoming someone else is finally learning to live as herself, and it's proving to be the most difficult role of all. In recent interviews, her voice doesn't carry the same fire it once did. There's a softness now, a stillness, as if she's grown tired of pretending that everything is fine. When asked about legacy, she doesn't speak of Oscars or her resume. She speaks of connection, of the things she lost while giving everything to her art. "I spent a lifetime performing," she admitted. "Now I want to understand who I am when the cameras stop rolling." But even now, as she begins to settle into the quieter corners of life, the ghosts haven't fully left her. One of them is the ache of never being fully recognized by her industry. 8 times she stood on that stage as a nominee. 8 times she smiled, gracious, elegant, hiding the sting as someone else's name was called. To the public, she wore the loss well. But in private, the pattern cut deep. It became a wound that never healed. A reminder that no matter how good she was, she would always be remembered as the woman who came close. Never quite enough. And yet, perhaps even more heartbreaking than that was something she revealed in a quiet, off-the-record moment to a close friend, now shared with permission. "Sometimes, I wonder if the only person who ever truly saw me was a character I played." That sentence hangs like a fog over her legacy, not bitter, but deeply sad. Because what Glenn Close is really mourning isn't an award or a missed opportunity, it's time. Time spent being what others needed. Time spent hiding her wounds behind craft. Time spent waiting to be chosen, not just by directors, but by life itself. And in that reflection lies the tragedy. Glenn Close gave the world everything, every emotion, every ounce of discipline, every fractured piece of herself. But the world, like so many others in her life, often took without giving back. These days, she spends more time with her daughter, more time in nature, more time with the questions that can't be answered with applause. She writes. She walks. She revisits old scripts and wonders what she missed the first time. And while she may never receive the golden statue that once felt like destiny, she's starting to understand that her worth was never held in gold. It was in survival, in endurance, in being a lighthouse for those who feel alone in their pain. And yet there is one moment, one deeply personal, almost unbearable moment, that still lingers in her soul. It was the night after her last Oscar loss, when she returned to her hotel room, pulled off her gown, wiped off her makeup, and sat in silence. No calls, no visitors, no celebration. Just her alone in front of a mirror, and as she stared at her own reflection, she whispered, "What more do I have to give?" That question, though never answered, now echoes as a quiet prayer. Not for fame, not for validation, but for peace. Because Glenn Close didn't just play the tragic roles, she lived them. And now, as the curtain gently begins to fall, all she wants is to be remembered not for the pain she performed, but for the strength it took to survive her own.